The stencil across the round, riveted head of her said dead steam, and under the two words, in the same dripping wrecking yard brush, $40, sprayed across the rusted front of a 9-ton riveted fire tube boiler that the salvage crews had cut from the shattered guts of the packet Rosalind the spring she let go, and that had stood ever since. Sealed and rusting on the weeds of the Selby Boneyard flat, better than 100 years, and on a raw bright Saturday in the fall of 1974, Lyle Ashworth, whose grandfather's name was still cut in the granite over the shut doors of the old Ashworth Line wharf house down the levee, ran the bidding up to $35 for the pure sport of the thing. Then folded his soft clean hands back into his camel coat and stepped off grinning, and Cal Vane, the second shift Boilermaker off the barge repair ways at the foot of the landing, said 40. The laugh that went up off that gravel flat rolled out flat over the Brown River and came back off the Kentucky shore a half-beat late, like the whole county laughing at itself twice. Somebody hollered that the Boilermaker had just paid top dollar for the one iron on this earth that had cooked its own crew, and a second voice, the one that took the biggest laugh, called out that no, boys, let him have her, he is buying his daddy's alibi. Cal Vane stood square in the cold wind off the water with his collar turned up, 46 years old. Boiler scale and red lead worked so deep into his knuckles that no lye soap ever quite lifted it, and he counted $40 into the salvage man's hand in soft ones and fives, and did not look at the laughing, and did not look at Lyle Ashworth, and looked only at the boiler, the way a man looks across a full room at a face he has been carrying a long time. Now, if you have ever stood in a crowd that laughed easy at a thing your own blood knew the truth of, pull your chair up close to the lamp tonight and stay a while, and if this porch light is new to you, go on and tap that subscribe before we get much farther down the levee. Because by the Thursday that followed, the two words stenciled on that boiler were about to become the costliest lie ever told on that whole stretch of the Ohio, and the bill was not going to come to the Boilermaker. The Rosalind had been dark since the wet spring of 1922, when she blew her starboard boiler at the head of Selby Chute and took 9 men down with her, and the wreckmen had raised what iron they could and the river had kept the rest, and, last of all, cut whole and unblown from the port side of her, came this boiler, a squat, riveted drum of a thing with a bolted smokebox door on her face and 200 and some fire tubes run through her heart and a manhole plate dogged shut in her crown. She wore a coat of scale like orange bark now, her tubes packed with 50 years of mud dauber nests and dust. And not one living soul had drawn a plate or a tube on her in all that time, and there was a reason for that past the rust, though it would be Thursday before the county learned it. To understand what happened in that shed, you have to come back with me to that wet spring of 1922, and to the last run the Rosalind ever made. The Ashworth Line held the mail and the fast freight on that reach of river, and it held them because the Rosalind ran the Louisville landing on a clock, and that spring arrival packet out of the lower company had begun shaving her times and talking to the postal men about the contract. And Merritt Ashworth, who owned the line and half the town it was named beside, was not a man to lose a contract to a faster boat. And the Rosalind's boilers were old, and one of them, the starboard, had been carrying a cracked butt seam and a shell scaled thin that any honest inspection would have condemned to the scrap flat that very season. And the man who ran that engine room, who knew to the pound of pressure exactly what those two old boilers could carry and what they could not, was the chief engineer, the man you need to know tonight, and his name was Isaac Vane. And he had fired and nursed and babied those boilers for 19 years, and loved them the way a good engineer loves iron he has kept alive past its time. And Isaac Vane knew the one fact that would give the whole official finding the lie, and it was this. The Rosalind was not lost to a careless engineer carrying too much steam of his own reckless will. 2 days before that last run, Merritt Ashworth had called his chief engineer up to the wharf office after dark, and told him the mail must make Louisville ahead of the lower company's boat or the contract was lost and the line with it, and had ordered Isaac Vane, in his own hand on the line's own letterhead, to hang the extra weight on the safety valves and carry the starboard boiler well above the pressure her certificate allowed, and Isaac Vane had stood in that office and told Merritt Ashworth that the starboard shell would not hold it, and Merritt Ashworth had told him to carry it regardless, that the boiler had been passed and the paper was clean and any question that came of it would fall on the engineer's judgment and not the owner's order. For the paper was clean. There had been an inspector up from the district that spring, a soft, heavy man named Coombs, whose word passed every hull the Ashworth line owned. And Coombs had written a fresh certificate on a boiler he had been paid handsome not to condemn, and Isaac Vane had watched him do it. And 2 nights later, at the head of Selby Chute, with the safety valves weighted down on Merritt Ashworth's order and the needle standing where no needle should ever stand, the starboard boiler found the thin, lied-about place in her old shell, and opened it all at once, and 9 men who had been shoveling and oiling and standing their watch in the dark went into the river, and the steam, and the Rosalind burned to her guardrails and settled in the chute. And Merritt Ashworth put on a black coat and buried the line's dead with the town watching, and then the Ashworth line told the coroner and the district and the papers the one story that cost the company nothing, that the boiler had been sound and lawfully passed, and the disaster was the sole and reckless act of a chief engineer who had carried steam far past his orders to make up a late landing on his own hook. And Isaac Vane, the one man on that boat who had begged in writing not to carry it, became overnight the man who had boiled his own crew. And Isaac Vane said otherwise. He said it to the county coroner, whose seat came up for election on Ashworth money, and was written down a discharged company hand with a grievance. He said it to the district steamboat inspectors down at the river office, who told him that a chief engineer's bare word against a paid and filed certificate and the sworn account of a chartered line would not stand up long enough to be read, and asked him, gently, whether a man who had just lost his boat and his berth and 9 of his own crew might be casting about for some other name to hang it on. And then came the thing that broke him for good, for the deaths had to have a cause, and the only man who had stood the throttle and knew the pressure and had lived to be blamed was the engineer. And the word went up and down the landing that there had been no wicked order at all. There was only Vane. That the chief had run her hot to save a schedule and killed 9 men doing it. And a town in mourning needed a face to hate, and Merritt Ashworth handed them one for nothing. Isaac Vane was tried for it, and no jury would quite convict him, and no court would ever clear him, which is the cruelest patch of ground a man can be made to stand on, and he lived out the whole rest of his life under that word, yard hand and night watchman and boiler tender at the cotton mill, the engineer who boiled the Rosalind's crew. And here is a small thing to carry in your pocket, the way a riverman pockets a dry match against the fog, for it will want striking before we are through. Along about the years that followed, when the scrapmen would have cut that surviving port boiler up for the metal of her like every other dead thing on the flat, it was Merritt Ashworth himself who moved through his agents to buy the boiler in and haul her onto his own boneyard and post her against all salvage, and paid yard rent and taxes on a rusted iron drum year after year to the end of his life, and left her sealed and whole and untouched, and nobody thought a thing of it. Why a rich man would spend good money and 40 years of care to keep one worthless burst boat's boiler from ever being cut open and looked at close. What Isaac Vane did with the rest of his life besides carry that word was raise his boy Cal, and across a great many winters at the shop bench teach that boy the iron. He could not get within Ashworth's posted fence of the real boiler, but he had kept from the wreck a scrapped section of a fire tube head with its rows of tube ends. And he set it on the bench under the lamp and taught the boy the trade on it, winter by winter, how a tube rolls into its seat and how you draw a dead one. How you read a boiler by tapping her and listening. How a driven tube rings tight and a plugged one rings dull. How iron carries the whole record of every pound it was ever asked to hold. And the great boiler's own particular he taught by mouth, over and over, like a hymn sung against the day the boy would need it and the teacher would be in the ground. 9 down the third row, Cal, count them off the front head, third row from the top, 9 tubes in, and that one is mine and no other. For I plugged her both ends and brazed her tight, and there is a copper case inside her that holds the whole truth of that boat. And mind you never bring a torch to her, son, not ever. For what I put in her is paper, and a man they called a burner of men is not going to have his own truth burned too. You open her cold, or you do not open her, you court that iron, you do not cut her. Cal asked him once, a boy with tube scale gray on his hands, why a man would keep those tubes counted all those years for a boiler chained behind a rich man's fence that he was never once to be let near. And Isaac Vane set down the tapping hammer and said the thing this whole story comes down to. Because a certificate is only ever as honest as the man that signs his name to it, son, and the iron does not lie even when the paper does, and one day somebody is going to have to open her and read her back. And I would as soon it was somebody who knew the truth and knew the machine both. For the two of them in one pair of hands is the only thing on this green earth Merritt Ashworth was ever afraid of. Isaac Vane died in the hard winter of 1961. Of a bad heart and a harder life, and the landing paper gave him 4 lines that called him a former riverman, and did not print the word it had carried about him for 40 years, but did not need to. For the whole town carried it already, and Merritt Ashworth had gone into the ground 3 years ahead of him, and with the old man gone his careful arrangement over that boneyard flat began to fray, agents let go, and yard rents lapsed, and the posted signs came down, and at last the estate liquidated the whole rotten acreage of scrap along the river. And some hired hand with a 4-inch brush painted the salvage company's entire opinion of that dead boiler across her rusted face in 2 black words and a number, and the old lie woke up grinning on a gravel flat that bright fall Saturday, when Lyle Ashworth, the grandson, wearing his grandfather's heavy gold ring, came down to see the last of the family scrap sold off and watch the Boilermaker. "Step out of the crowd. I would have run you clean to 100, Ashworth said, coming by while Cal counted out the bills, but a man's charity has a bottom to it. You can tell your daddy's ghost the Ashworths sent their regards." And Cal Vane looked up at him then for the first and only time that morning and said, "Much obliged for the bidding, Mr. Ashworth. You have made her cheap at the price." He hauled her home on a lowboy in the last gray light, past the very head of the chute where the Rosalind had let go, and his wife Nell came out onto the step of their little place by the ways when he backed the trailer up to the machine shed. The $40 had been the grocery money and the better part of the light bill both, and the two of them knew it to the dollar, and she looked a long while at the great scaled drum on the trailer bed, and then at her husband's face, and whatever she had come out onto the step to say she sat down quiet and let it lie. "Your father always swore she would give up what she held to the right hand in a cold enough night," Nell said. "I will put the coffee on." And that, friends, is how it came to be that at 7 o'clock on a raw November evening, in a tin machine shed under one hung drop light, a Boilermaker rolled a nail keg up in front of his father's whole ruined life and went to work. Now the crowd had looked at 9 tons of rusted iron and seen a job for a cutting torch, and a torch was the one thing on this earth that would have burned the truth out of her before it was ever read, and Cal knew it in his hands the way his father had put it there. So he brought no flame. He brought patience. He worked penetrating oil and graphite into the seized bolts of the smokebox door and the dogged manhole in her crown, warming the plates soft with the drop light and chasing them cool with a wrung-wet rag, coaxing 50 years of rust to turn loose its grip one thread at a time, and it was gone 9 o'clock before the first smokebox bolt gave up and backed out grudging into his palm. He drew the manhole plate first up in her crown and put the light down into the water side of her, and for the space of 10 slow heartbeats the whole night nearly went to ruin. For down on the wet floor of her lay a rotted oilcloth packet that the one weeping rivet in her back seam had reached across the years, and Cal lifted it, and the paper came apart to mush in his fingers. Illegible. Gone. And Nell saw her husband's shoulders go down, and 50 years of the word on Isaac Vane very nearly had the last say in that shed. And then Cal Vane sat back on the keg and said, out loud, to the boiler and to his dead father both, no, not the water side, the fireside. 9 down the 3rd row. He went around to her face and drew the last of the smokebox bolts and swung the heavy door back on its rust, and there was the front tube head, 200 and some tube ends staring out of the dark in their ordered rows, and the smell came up out of her then, the strangest thing of the whole night. Not river and not rot, but the smell of a clean, dry, closed place. Old brass and gun oil and cold iron and a ghost of coal smoke, the wet of half a century never once passed that brazed, tight tube. And Cal Vane put his scarred finger on the top row and counted down, 1, 2, 3, and ran his finger 9 tubes in along the 3rd, and there she was. A tube end that did not ring like her sister's when he tapped her, but gave back a dull dead note, plugged and brazed by a hand 50 years cold. And he worked the machined plug loose turn by turn, and drew out of the dark heart of that tube a length of soldered copper case, dry and whole and light as a letter. And he cut the solder with his knife and slid out onto the bench under the droplight everything his father had sealed away against this exact night. There was Isaac Vane's own steam log. The pressures he had carried entered in his square hand with the ordered figures underlined, and the word ordered written beside them in the margin. There was the real inspection sheet, the one Coombs had written and buried, condemning the starboard shell in plain language before a clean certificate was ever filed over the top of it. And there, folded once inside the log, on the Ashworth Line's own letterhead in a heavy owner's own slanting hand, was the order, dated 2 days before the boat let go. And Cal read it out loud to his wife at midnight, because it was not a thing a man could read to himself in that kind of quiet. It directed the chief engineer to weight the safety valves down and carry the starboard boiler at a pressure the writer set out by the figure, well past her rating, until the Louffle Mail was made ahead of the lower company's boat, and it said in the owner's plain hand that the boiler had been passed and the certificate was in order and would answer any inquiry, and that the manner of carrying the steam was left to the engineer's discretion and the engineer's account, so that whatever came of the run was his affair and not the office's. And it was signed in full, Merritt Ashworth, and under the name a cold line reminding the engineer that the contract, and every berth on the river that hung from it, was the only thing that mattered that week. He had written it all down, friends, the whole cold machine of it, put his own name to the order and the deniability both, and handed it to the one man he was certain could never make it stand. And then the one thing no cunning ever reckons on had reckoned with him, for Isaac Vane had brazed that order into the 9th tube of the boiler the owner himself would spend a fortune keeping locked away. And Merritt Ashworth went to his grave certain of an engineer no jury would clear and an iron no man would open. Cal read it through twice more and then said the only thing he said that whole night that was not part of the reading. He signed his name to it, Nell, because he was dead sure the only hand that would ever hold it was a dead man's, or a ruined one's. They did not sleep. At first light Cal shaved and put on his one good shirt, and he did not go to the coroner's heirs, and he did not go to a lawyer on the square. He drove first out to old Tobias Fenn, who had struck and fired for Isaac Vane on the Rosalind and been off watch the night she blew, and had carried his own smaller share of that word for 50 years, near 90 now and near blind. And then to a young woman named Ada Sprague, who had lately taken over the landing paper, the Selby Courier, and whose own grandfather Nathan Sprague had been one of the 9 firemen the shoot took. And both of them read Merritt Ashworth's order through, and old Tobias Fenn laid his shaking hand flat over the signature and wept. For the town had called Isaac Vane a killer across the whole of his life, and the man who ordered those 9 deaths had signed for them in his own hand and hid the paper in the very iron he warehoused to keep the world from ever looking too close. On the Thursday morning, in the high courtroom over the county offices, because it was the one room in the town that would hold the crowd, Cal Vane stood up before better than 300 people, the sons and grandsons and widows of the men that shoot had taken, and read Merritt Ashworth's order out loud, slow and level, and you could hear the radiators tick along the wall. Iron remembers every pound of pressure a man ever puts to it, Cal said before he read, and it does not care one bit whose name is on the order, for sooner or later somebody comes along and reads it back. Tobias Fenn swore to the boiler and to the weighted valves and to the ordered steam with his palm on his own worn Bible, and a river surveyor swore that the port boiler's twin shell showed the same thin, lied-about iron the buried report had named, and when the honest old judge, an elected man the family money had somehow never quite reached, asked Cal Vane whether he understood he had arguably bought that boiler and every last thing inside her fair and clear at public sale, $40 paid in full. Cal Vane said the sentence Ada Sprague set in type across the whole front of the Courier that week. The truth in that tube was never mine, Your Honor, and it was never Merritt Ashworth's to sign away. It belonged to 9 men who went into the chute on his order and to the families they left on the bank, and to a chief engineer who begged in writing not to carry that steam and got called a killer for the rest of his days. I bought a boiler. I mean to keep the boiler. Give these families back their men, and give my father back his name, for a man's good name is the one thing they can steal that no thief ever gets to spend. And then the making whole began, and it went on the better part of 2 years. The old wrongful death claims the frame had killed off were reopened for fraud, and the estate of Merritt Ashworth and the assets of the Ashworth line were cracked open in probate in the same courthouse the Little River Empire had been run from, and family after family of the 9 came to a table in that hall and had their loss paid out at last with 50 years of interest against it. Out of Ashworth ground and Ashworth stock sold to cover it, and Ada Sprague printed the 9 names in the Courier week after week like a casualty list run backward, the wronged coming home a column at a time, and the Ashworth name came down off the wharf house and off the wing of the river hospital before the next spring was out. Lyle Ashworth was never charged, for the whole sin was proved on an order more than 50 years old in a dead grandfather's hand. But a man who sat near him through the reading said his face never moved the entire time except once, that when Cal read the line making the run the engineer's own affair and not the office's, Lyle Ashworth looked down at the heavy gold ring on his hand, his grandfather's ring, and closed his other hand over it the way a man covers a hurt he does not want the room to see. The lawyer came the next winter up from the city in a good gray topcoat, sent, he allowed, by parties who only wished to see old and painful matters laid quietly and permanently to rest, and he offered Cal Vane $19,000 for the boiler and a signed paper that the Vane family held no further claim against any living soul, and called the figure generous, and as figures go, it was. Cal Vane heard him all the way out, and then told him no, and told him why, and the why is the part worth keeping. The boiler is not for sale, he said, and the paint on her face is not for sale, and there is no figure at all for the rest of it, because my father set the price on this thing 50 years ago, standing in a river office in front of an inspector who told him a chief engineer's word was worth nothing against a paid certificate, and the price he set was never money. The price was only ever that somebody believe him. "You have come 50 years too late, mister, and you have brought the wrong tender. Good evening to you." And the boiler he set on a poured pad beside the little house by the ways, her face turned out to the river, and one evening the following fall a long clean car slowed a moment on the levee road with the motor running. And Lyle Ashworth looked out at that boiler standing square on her pad, and Cal, oiling the smokebox hinge in the last light, did not raise his hand and did not raise his voice, and the car went on down toward the landing, and somehow that was enough. The Vane name came off the coroner's old rolls of the guilty, and Isaac Vane got a proper stone at last. Up in the little cemetery on the bench above the river, his name cut deep and spelled right, and under the name, paid for by subscription of the 9 families and half the town besides, are 4 words. He was no killer, and if you have ever wanted to know what a whole river town taking back the worst thing it ever said sounds like, it sounds like a chisel working stone. The county took the boiler in the end for the little river museum it made of the old wharf boat, and Cal rubbed her scale down with boiled oil and lampblack until she came up soft and dark like the finish on an old anvil. But he never ground the 2 black words off her face, and never painted over them. For over dead steam and the number he set a pane of glass in a frame of angle iron he welded up, himself, so that no idle thumb would ever wipe the salvage crew's whole verdict away, and under that glass to this day it says "Dead Steam, $40, in a wrecking hand's dripping brush, and inside her, in the 9th tube of the 3rd row where the copper case had lain, sits a photostat of Merritt Ashworth's order, and when the schoolchildren come out to lay a hand on her cold riveted head, and one of them asks why his father kept those tubes counted all those years for a boiler he was never once let near, Cal Vane says the same thing every time. "My father ran an honest engine room his whole life, and he knew a thing the men in the good coats never troubled to learn, that a certificate is only ever as honest as the man that signs it, but the iron does not lie. So you keep your own word like it was brazed into steel, for you never do know how long the keeping has to last. Now if you have sat up the whole night here in the lamplight with me, I am glad you rode along, and before you go, leave me your verdict down in the comments, for this one has 2 keepers, and I have never once been able to settle it in my own mind. Who gave that river back its good name in the end? The chief engineer, who told the truth the very week of the disaster, and was called a killer for it and went to his grave with the word still on him? Or the Boilermaker who carried his dead father's counting into a cold tin shed one November night 50 years later and finally drew the 9th tube? Make the case for me, and tell me what town and what river or road you are keeping watch from tonight, for this porch light draws folks from a good deal farther off than any packet ever landed. And then come on back next time, for there is always another sale, and another lot the whole crowd priced wrong at a single laughing glance, and another quiet buyer standing at the back who saw plain as morning the thing that was worth unseen. The last of the light off the river that evening fell on a pane of glass over 2 black words in dripping paint, and on a great riveted drum standing square on her pad at last, and on a Boilermaker on his own ground, oiling a hinge and watching the water go by.